Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here for this deep dive.
So I want you to imagine walking into one of the great architectural wonders of the world. Like, let's use St. Paul's Cathedral in London as our mental starting point for today.
Oh, that's a perfect example. The scale of that place is just incredible.
Right. You step off that super busy street, you walk through those massive wooden doors, and the very first thing that hits you isn't some intellectual idea. It's a total, overwhelming sensory experience.
Yeah, the air is instantly cooler.
Exactly. And the acoustics completely change the sound of your own footsteps. You look up at that staggering dome, you run your hand along those cold stone pillars, and your mind just immediately registers this profound sense of permanence.
Because it survives so much, right?
Yeah, it survived wars, it survived centuries of weather. It just projects this aura of absolute unshakable security.
And that physical weight, it translates directly into a feeling of psychological safety. I mean, when we're surrounded by something that imposing, something you can actually measure and shelter inside, we naturally just assume it is the ultimate reality in that space.
We give the structure our total reverence.
We really do. We give it all the credit.
But, and here's where it gets interesting, if we pause and think critically about the origins of that cathedral, this fascinating paradox emerges. The most important foundational element of St. Paul's Cathedral actually isn't the stone.
Right. It's not the mortar or the glass.
No, or the lead roofing. The most critical element was entirely invisible. It was the mind of the architect. It was Sir Christopher Wren's vision, his understanding of geometry, his grasp of physics and tension.
The bricks are just the physical expression of his invisible genius.
Exactly. But human nature being what it is, we stand in total awe of the bricks. And we almost completely forget the architect who gave those bricks their actual meaning.
We do that all the time. We constantly mistake the visible expression for the invisible foundation. I mean, it happens in architecture, but much more dangerously, it happens in our institutions.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, in our traditions, our belief systems, we attach our deepest loyalties to the visible structures we can see and touch, and we completely lose sight of the underlying principles or, the architects that built them.
And this tension, this battle between trusting the visible institution versus trusting the invisible architect, that is the beating heart of our discussion today.
It really is.
We are pulling wisdom from a fascinating, really complex ancient text today. We're looking at chapters 3 and 4 of the biblical book of Hebrews.
And to guide us through this, we're relying on the World English Bible Translation, along with the historical insights of two really monumental commentators, Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
Right. But our mission today isn't just to look at the history, though. I mean, the history is incredible. We want to extract the psychology, the moral insight, and the practical realities hidden in this text. We want to see how they challenge the way you navigate your 21st century life.
To really get why the author of Hebrews is pushing this specific architectural analogy, we have to kind of reconstruct the world of his original audience.
Yeah, set the stage for us. Who are these people?
So these were first-century Jewish Christians. The term Hebrews points directly to their deep ancestral, cultural, and religious roots. And at the exact moment this text was written, they were enduring this agonizing crisis of identity and survival.
They were under a lot of pressure, right?
Intense pressure, daily pressure to apostatize, basically to publicly abandon their new allegiance to Jesus and just return to the established, safe traditions of Judaism.
I try to put myself in their shoes, and the pressure must have been incomprehensible. We were just talking about, changing a philosophical label here. Judaism in the first century had the ultimate buildings, both literally and metaphorically.
Oh, absolutely. They had the physical temple in Jerusalem.
Think about the sensory power of that space. The smell of burning incense and sacrifices, the chanting of the Levitical choirs, those massive gold-adorned walls. It was the center of their entire universe.
It was a whole ecosystem of belonging. They had centuries of unbroken tradition. They had the Levitical priesthood, which, gave them this highly structured, visible daily system for dealing with guilt and accessing the divine.
There's a safety net.
a massive social safety net, totally woven into their religious identity. So for a Jewish person to walk away from all of that visible security, to follow a crucified, invisible Messiah, I mean, it would have felt like abandoning a massive fortified castle to go stand completely alone in a dark, empty field.
Wow. Yeah, the social ostracism alone would mean losing your business, being cut off from your family. You'd be viewed as a dangerous radical by both your own people and the Roman Empire.
Exactly. The psychological exhaustion of standing in that empty field while the warm lights of the fortress are just right over the hill, it must have been unbearable.
The temptation wasn't just theological at all. It was a primal desire for safety.
Yes. So the author of Hebrews has this incredibly urgent, really high-stakes task. He has to convince these exhausted people to hold the line. He has to persuade them not to run back to the fortress.
And he begins in chapter 3 by taking on the greatest, most unassailable hero of their ancestral history. He tackles Moses.
The rhetorical skill he uses here is just brilliant. I mean, if you're going to challenge a people's foundational structure, you cannot start by insulting their heroes.
Right. That would immediately alienate them.
Exactly. And to a first-century Jew, Moses was the absolute pinnacle of human history. He was the man who faced down Pharaoh, who called down the plagues, who literally split the Red Sea.
He was the ultimate founder.
Most importantly, he was the lawgiver who spoke to the divine on Mount Sinai. And the author of Hebrews absolutely affirms this. In the first 6 verses of chapter 3, he states unequivocally that Moses was faithful in all his house.
So he's not tearing Moses down.
Not at all. Albert Barnes, in his commentary, points out that the author grants Moses every single ounce of honor and reverence that a Jewish reader would demand. There is zero diminishing of his legacy.
But then comes the pivot. And this brings us right back to our cathedral analogy. The text argues that Jesus is counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who hath builded the house hath more honor than the house.
It's a sharp, categorical distinction between a servant in the house and the creator over the house. Moses was an instrument.
A vital instrument, but still an instrument.
Right. A deeply faithful instrument, but an instrument nonetheless. He was part of the structure used to govern and edify the people.
Matthew Henry's commentary dwells on this distinction really deeply, doesn't it?
He does. He says that drawing the ground plan of a community, providing the moral materials, and arranging them into a functioning entity that requires the power of the creator. The builder is just categorically superior to the building materials.
Let's translate this into our current reality for a second. Most of us listening today aren't facing this specific temptation to return to first-century Judaism. But human psychology, it hasn't changed at all.
No, not one bit.
We are still obsessed with the bricks. We stand in awe of our modern institutions. We venerate visionary tech founders, charismatic political leaders, brilliant mentors, high-profile spiritual leaders.
We look at the house they've built, the corporate empire, the political movement, the organization, and we place our ultimate psychological trust in them.
We load the entire weight of our worldview onto human shoulders. We assume that because the structure they built provides us with a sense of security, the human leader is somehow infallible.
But what happens when that servant in the house fails? Because, let's be honest, it is a statistical certainty that human beings will fail.
Always.
They make catastrophic moral errors, they succumb to greed, their hidden scandals are exposed, or they simply just burn out and make terrible leadership decisions.
I've seen this happen so many times, and the fallout is always devastating. When a revered leader falls, the followers don't just lose respect for the person. Their entire worldview shatters.
They become completely disillusioned with the underlying principles themselves.
Right. If a prominent advocate for a cause turns out to be a fraud, people abandon the cause entirely. Why? Because they had attached their ultimate confidence to the building materials instead of the architect. They conflated the flawed human messenger with the flawless truth.
And that phenomenon is exactly what the author of Hebrews is desperately trying to prevent here. By urging the reader to consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, he's basically providing a psychological survival strategy.
He's arguing that if you anchor your existence to the flawless builder, your foundation remains perfectly intact, even when the human servants in the house let you down.
Exactly. Your faith in truth, your sense of purpose, your moral compass, all of that survives the collapse of the institution.
You know, this challenges me deeply. It forces a really uncomfortable audit of where my actual trust lies. Because it's easy to say we trust the principles or the architect, But our anxiety levels usually reveal the truth.
Oh, that's a great point. The anxiety is the tell.
Yeah, when a specific institution or leader is threatened and we feel absolute existential panic, it's a profound indicator that we've confused the bricks for the builder. The shared human struggle here is our desperate need for a visible savior.
We want someone we can see, touch, and measure to guarantee our safety.
We do. And recognizing that tendency is really the first step toward building resilience.
Yeah.
But the author of Hebrews knows that pointing out the flawless architect isn't quite enough.
No, he understands human stubbornness too well for that. He knows that simply having a superior foundation available doesn't mean people will actually build on it.
Right.
So he transitions from the logic of who we should trust to a terrifying historical case study of what actually happens when a community fundamentally refuses to trust.
And the warning he uses is rooted in the darkest chapter of their history, the wilderness generation. In chapter 3, the author quotes extensively from Psalm 95, "Today, if you will hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as in the rebellion."
He forces his audience to look back at the ancestors who were delivered from slavery in Egypt.
The historical narrative is essential here, isn't it?
It is. The Israelites were freed from Egypt through a series of unprecedented, spectacular events. They crossed the Red Sea. They were on their way to the land of Canaan, the Promised Land.
And geographically, that journey shouldn't have taken long at all.
Not at all. Yet that entire adult generation wandered in a barren desert for 40 years until they died. They never saw the fulfillment of the promise. And the text diagnoses the root cause of this catastrophic failure in a single phrase.
They failed to enter because of an evil heart of unbelief.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, when I hear the word unbelief in a modern context, my mind immediately goes to, intellectual skepticism. We picture someone demanding a peer-reviewed study, or someone debating the historical accuracy of a text. We treat unbelief as a lack of sufficient data.
Right, like an intellectual hurdle.
Yeah. But looking at the historical context of the wilderness generation, that definition completely falls apart. I mean, these people weren't lacking empirical evidence, were they?
They had more tangible evidence than literally any generation in history. They watched a sea physically part. They stood at the base of Mount Sinai while it shook with thunder and smoke.
They saw it all.
When they were thirsty, water flowed from solid rock. When they were starving, a substance they called manna literally appeared on the ground every single morning to keep them alive. They had a pillar of cloud guiding them by day and a pillar of fire by night. Intellectual proof of the divine presence was definitely not their problem.
So if it wasn't a lack of evidence, what exactly made their hearts evil and filled with unbelief? What is the actual definition being used here?
Albert Barnes explores this brilliantly in his commentary. He notes that the specific flavor of unbelief here is a deep-seated, almost malicious lack of confidence.
A lack of confidence.
Yeah. Despite the daily miracles keeping them alive, their default psychological posture was unyielding cynicism. They continually erred in their hearts, meaning their internal compass was just entirely broken.
So every time they faced a new obstacle, they just defaulted to paranoia.
Exactly. A lack of water, a formidable enemy. They didn't look at their track record of miraculous survival. Instead, they immediately accused the divine of having malicious intent. They basically claimed they were brought out into the desert specifically to be murdered.
Wow. They assumed the architect was actively trying to destroy them. It was a complete failure of trust in the character and goodness of the Creator.
It was. And Barnes uses a really fascinating thought experiment to illustrate why this kind of distrust is so devastating. He asks us to imagine a human society where all confidence completely evaporates.
It's a haunting analogy. Think about the invisible threads that hold our modern world together. What happens if neighbors suddenly have absolutely zero trust in their neighbors?
And it's terrifying to even picture.
What if spouses assume every action of their partner is a malicious trap?
Mm-hmm.
What if citizens completely distrust the banks, the markets, the food supply chain, and the rule of law?
Society doesn't just slow down, it violently tears itself apart. If I believe my neighbor is plotting against me, I preemptively attack him. If I don't trust the currency, the entire economy halts in a single afternoon.
Right. If I don't trust my spouse, the home becomes a psychological war zone where sleep is impossible because you are constantly monitoring for betrayal.
Trust isn't just a nice emotional bonus, is it? It is the absolute prerequisite for human flourishing.
And that is the exact logical leap Barnes is making regarding the divine here. If a lack of trust destroys human relationships and entire civilizations so rapidly, it is an inescapable conclusion that a cynical, malicious lie of confidence in the Creator would absolutely short-circuit a human soul.
The evil heart of unbelief isn't about failing a theology exam. It's about choosing a toxic, paranoid isolation over a relationship built on trust.
That makes perfect sense in the psychology, but we have to address a massive obstacle in the text here.
The language.
Yeah, the language the author uses, quoting the Old Testament, is incredibly harsh to modern ears. God is described as being grieved, being angry, and even swearing in his wrath that their carcasses would fall in the wilderness.
It's heavy.
I'll be honest, when people read this today, it sounds like an angry Zeus throwing a lightning bolt because humans didn't stroke his ego enough. It sounds petty and vindictive. So how do we navigate this concept of wrath without just dismissing the text or accepting a tyrannical view of God?
Well, it requires really careful discernment and a willingness to look past our modern cultural baggage regarding the word anger. Matthew Henry provides a crucial lens here. He focuses on the timeline mentioned in the text.
40 years.
40 years. God endured their constant complaints, their baseless accusations, their rebellion, and their profound cynicism for 4 entire decades while continuing to feed them every single morning. That is not the behavior of a volatile, petty tyrant having a sudden temper tantrum.
No, 40 years of patience completely changes the dynamic. It's the difference between snapping at a child who makes a mistake and continuing to support a self-destructive adult for decades while they constantly insult you.
Precisely. And in this context, the wrath of God is not a sudden explosion of vindictive emotion. It is the tragic, righteous, and inevitable consequence of a severed relationship.
When a person, or an entire generation, absolutely insists on distrusting the very source of their life.
The natural consequence is that they are eventually left to the reality they have stubbornly chosen. The wrath is the handing over of the people to their own autonomy. They chose the wilderness of the mind, a landscape of paranoia and self-reliance, and so the divine gave them what they demanded. They received the wilderness of reality.
They locked the door from the inside.
They did.
And the author warns that we are in danger of doing the exact same thing through what he calls the deceitfulness of sin. Matthew Henry notes that sin is incredibly deceptive because it appears fair, but performs nothing.
It makes promises it absolutely cannot keep.
In our modern context, the deceitfulness of sin often looks like a really sophisticated, self-protective cynicism. We get hurt by a friend or an institution or just life in general, and we decide that trusting anyone, including God, is naive.
We harden our hearts just a little bit every day, telling ourselves we are simply being realistic or pragmatic.
We build calluses over our vulnerabilities, thinking we are protecting ourselves, but we are actually cutting off our own oxygen supply. The tragedy of a hardened heart is that it eventually becomes incapable of receiving genuine love or experiencing true joy. You become impervious to the very things you desperately need.
So how does the author of Hebrews tell his audience to fight this? Because he doesn't just say, try harder to feel trusting.
That never works.
He provides a highly specific communal antidote. The text says, "Exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin."
The prescription is entirely relational. The author understands that you cannot survive the wilderness of your own mind in isolation.
Isolation is the perfect breeding ground for cynicism. When you are alone with your own anxieties and your own self-protective narratives, the deceitfulness of sin just thrives in that dark echo chamber. There is no counter-narrative to challenge your growing paranoia.
You need a community. You need people who will look you in the eye and speak truth to you. People who will gently but firmly pull you back when they see you drifting into chronic distrust. And look at the profound urgency of the timeline here, while it's called today.
That urgency is arguably the most challenging part of the prescription, because we are masters of deferring our own growth.
Oh, absolutely.
We tell ourselves, I will deal with my anger issues when my stress at work dies down, or I will invest in a real vulnerable community after we move to a new house. I will figure out my spiritual life tomorrow.
But the author is slamming the brakes on that entire mindset. Today is literally the only currency you actually possess. Procrastination in the realm of the heart isn't a neutral delay. It is an active choice to remain hardened for another 24 hours.
Every time you delay softening your heart, you add another microscopic layer of callus.
The shared struggle here is our fear of vulnerability. Exhorting one another daily requires letting people see our flaws. It requires admitting that we are frightened or cynical or exhausted. It is much easier to keep our armor on and plan to take it off tomorrow.
But the tragedy of the wilderness generation wasn't just that they died in a geographical desert. It was that their persistent daily choice of unbelief ultimately locked them out of the promised rest.
And the concept of that rest brings us to an incredible theological turning point. The author of Hebrews makes a stunning pivot in chapter 4. He reveals that the rest promised to the Israelites was never merely about a piece of real estate in the Middle East. It wasn't just about crossing the Jordan River and claiming physical territory.
He builds a brilliant, airtight, logical argument here. He points out that Joshua eventually did lead the next generation into the physical land of Canaan. If that geographical conquest was the ultimate fulfillment of the promise, then King David, writing centuries later in Psalm 95, wouldn't still be warning the people about a future today and urging them not to miss the rest.
Right.
The author concludes, "There remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God."
And the original language here provides a massive clue, doesn't it? The Greek word used is sabbatismos. From what the commentators point out, this is a highly unique term.
It is entirely unique. It appears literally nowhere else in the New Testament. It is a specialized word crafted to convey a concept that goes far beyond the weekly observance of Saturday and way beyond the borders of the physical promised land.
So what does it actually point to?
To define sabbatismos, the author bypasses Moses, bypasses Joshua, and goes all the way back to the dawn of existence. He connects this ultimate rest to God, resting on the seventh day of creation.
I always try to visualize these ancient concepts. When we hear that God rested on the seventh day, our human framework immediately pictures exhaustion. We picture someone collapsing on a couch after a brutal 60-hour work week.
Right.
But the creator of the cosmos doesn't have lactic acid building up in his muscles. He doesn't experience fatigue. So what does his rest actually look like?
It is the rest of absolute, flawless completion. God ceased from his work of creation, not because he lacked energy, but because the work was perfect. There was nothing more to add. No brush stroke could improve the masterpiece.
Wow.
Sabbatismos is the profound divine satisfaction of a finished work. And the staggering claim of Hebrews chapter 4 is that humans are invited to spiritually enter into and participate in that exact same divine satisfaction.
I find it really helpful to compare this to other streams of human thought. Almost every major wisdom tradition seeks an escape from the relentless exhaustion of human existence. Buddhism seeks nirvana, breaking the wheel of suffering and desire. Stoicism seeks apatheia, achieving an inner fortress of tranquility that is completely immune to the chaos of outside circumstances.
Yeah, many modern philosophies seek a sort of detached mindfulness.
Exactly. But the sabbatismos presented in Hebrews frames the solution very differently.
It's a vital distinction. In many philosophical traditions, the ultimate goal is a dissolution of the self, an emptying out of desire, or a detachment from the physical reality. But sabbatismos is not a dissolution. It is an active, joyous, fully conscious participation in the Creator's own eternal Sabbath.
You are not emptying yourself to become nothing.
No, you are surrendering your own frantic effort so you can be filled with the peace of the architect's finished work. You are stepping into a reality that has already been perfectly prepared for you.
This sounds incredibly beautiful and serene until you hit verse 11 of chapter 4. This verse has always felt like a massive speed bump to me. The text says, "Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest."
Yeah, that catches a lot of people off guard.
Why in the world do we have to work so hard just to rest? Laboring to rest feels like a complete oxymoron.
On the surface, it sounds entirely contradictory, but when we examine the psychology of our own behavior, it makes perfect, agonizing sense. Consider the modern culture we live in. We are an exhausted society. We are dealing with burnout at unprecedented levels. But we aren't just physically tired from manual labor.
No, we are spiritually and emotionally drained by the endless, invisible treadmill of self-justification.
Exactly. We spend every waking moment trying to prove that we deserve to exist. We use our careers as a resume submitted to the universe. We use our bank accounts, the prestige of our degrees, the behavior of our children, and the perfectly curated, filtered images we project on social media to build a case for our own worth.
We are constantly building our own little kingdoms to prove we matter.
And that process is an absolute addiction. It is driven by the ego's desperate need for control. Stopping that frantic production feels like death to the ego. To drop your resume, to stop trying to add your own brushstrokes to the canvas, and to simply accept that you are loved and valued because of a finished work you did not accomplish, that requires immense psychological effort.
The labor the author is talking about is the violent fight against our own addiction to self-reliance. It is the intense, intentional, and often daily struggle to shut off the noise of the world, to quiet the screaming demands of our ego, and to actually trust the architect, It takes massive diligence to stop trusting in ourselves.
And that resistance to trusting outside of ourselves is exactly why the warning is tied directly back to the wilderness generation. The text warns us to labor to enter that rest, that no man fall after the same example of disobedience or unbelief.
The moment we start thinking we have to justify ourselves through our own works, we step right back into the wilderness.
We start wandering in circles of anxiety, paranoia, and exhaustion, completely locked out of the peace that is freely available.
The shared struggle here is confronting our own pride. It is humiliating to admit that my frantic resume building is actually a form of deep spiritual distrust. It means admitting I don't really believe the work is finished.
Yeah, that's a hard pill to swallow.
But here's the next major problem. Humans are brilliant at self-deception. We are incredibly skilled at convincing ourselves that we are resting, when in reality, we're just numbing ourselves. We binge-watch television, we endlessly scroll our phones, we engage in surface-level wellness routines, and we tell ourselves we are entering a Sabbath rest.
We mistake distraction for peace. We mistake a momentary pause in our anxiety for the deep, structural sabbatismos.
So how do we pierce through our own layers of self-deceit? How do we get an accurate diagnosis of what is actually happening in our hearts? The author anticipates this exact problem, and he provides a terrifying but absolutely vital tool.
The transition in the text here is abrupt and really jarring. Right after discussing the peace of this ultimate rest, Hebrews 4.12 introduces an instrument of profound exposure. For the word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing of soul and spirit, of both joints and marrow, and is able to discern the thoughts and intentions of the heart.
It doesn't stop there. Verse 13 raises the stakes. And there is no creature that is hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and laid open before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. This is arguably one of the most intense, penetrating psychological verses in all of ancient literature.
To fully grasp the intensity, we have to look closely at the Greek imagery used here. The text describes the word as quick, a term in Older English that meant vital, pulsing with life, dynamically active. It is not a static, dusty scroll.
It's alive.
Yes, but the climax of the imagery is found at the end of verse 13. The words translated as naked and laid open. Albert Barnes provides a fascinating, visceral analysis of the specific Greek word used for laid open trechalizo.
Walk us through trechalizo. What is the visual the author is trying to evoke?
The root of the word is trachelos, which refers to the neck. In the context of ancient religious sacrifices, it referred to the highly specific action of taking the sacrificial animal, physically grabbing its head, and pulling the neck back to completely expose the throat to the knife of the priest.
Wait, literally bending the neck back.
Yes, exposing the throat completely. There is no armor there. There is no bone protecting the vital arteries.
It is the posture of absolute, unmitigated vulnerability.
Exactly. Other linguistic scholars suggest it evokes the imagery of a Roman wrestling match, where a victor has his opponent in a chokehold, bending his neck back so he is completely paralyzed, helpless, and exposed to the crowd. Whichever specific metaphor the author intended, the psychological meaning is identical.
It describes a state of terrifying, total exposure.
You cannot deflect. You cannot spin the narrative. Your deepest, most carefully hidden motives are laid entirely bare before a cosmic observer.
Let's reframe the imagery of the sword used in verse 12, because I think our modern minds often misread the intention here. Usually when we hear the word sword in a religious text, we picture a weapon of war. We imagine a knight on a battlefield violently hacking away at an enemy to destroy them.
Right, a broadsword.
Yeah. But when you read Matthew Henry's commentary, he focuses on the precision of the blade. It divides soul and spirit, joints and marrow. That doesn't describe the chaotic swinging of a broadsword. It perfectly describes the meticulous, agonizingly precise work of a surgeon's scalpel.
Oh, that distinction changes how we experience the entire passage. A warrior swings a sword with the intent to kill. A surgeon wields a scalpel with the ultimate intent to heal. But the process of healing often requires cutting deep into the flesh.
The surgeon has to cut away the diseased tissue. This divine scalpel cuts into us not to destroy us, but to dissect us. It removes the tumor of our self-deceit. It separates our noble-sounding, socially acceptable excuses from our actual selfish intentions. It is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart.
Think about how often we lie to ourselves about our own motives. Why do we volunteer for a specific cause? Is it true compassion, or are we desperately trying to curate a public image of virtue?
Right. Why are we arguing with our spouse? Are we really trying to find the truth? Or is our ego simply refusing to lose the fight?
We layer our actions with so much rationalization that we lose sight of our own darkness. The living word acts as the scalpel that slices through the rationalization and reveals the raw, unvarnished truth of why we do what we do.
And this highlights a massive, deeply ingrained obstacle to human growth. Total vulnerability is our greatest fear. We spend our entire adult lives constructing psychological defenses. We build elaborate personas for the workplace, for our social circles, even for our families.
We learn how to spin our failures to make them look like learning experiences.
We optimize our image relentlessly. The idea of having our ugliest motives, our deepest jealousies, and our secret petty resentments exposed makes us want to run and hide in the darkest cave we can find. It is imposter syndrome realized on a cosmic scale.
We have to acknowledge and validate the terror of that exposure. It is profoundly uncomfortable to be truly known. When the unfiltered light of truth shines into the dark, dusty corners of your psyche, it is painful. But this is where we must apply wisdom.
You can't heal without it.
Exactly. Healing is fundamentally impossible without an accurate diagnosis. You cannot cure a psychological or spiritual disease that you refuse to look at. The pain of the scalpel is the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite to spiritual health.
The shared struggle we face today is that we live in an era where we are trained to constantly critique everything around us. We critique the media we consume, the leaders we follow, and we certainly sit in judgment over ancient texts. If a text makes us uncomfortable, we deconstruct it and dismiss it.
But what if we reverse that dynamic?
What if we allow the living word to critique us? What if we stop trying to edit the text and let the text edit our pride?
If you refuse to allow the truth to cut you, you ensure your own stagnation. You may remain comfortably numb behind your carefully constructed defenses, but you will be spiritually dead. You will never, ever enter the sabbatismos rest we discussed because you will spend the rest of your life exhausting yourself trying to maintain your disguise.
But man, if we actually submit to this, it leaves us in a remarkably precarious position. Think about the sequence the authors walked us through. He told us to drop our resumes and stop trying to justify ourselves. Then he told us we were completely exposed with our necks bent back, our defenses stripped away, and our darkest secrets laid bare before a holy, omniscient God.
Logically, we should be paralyzed by fear.
We should be waiting for the executioner's blow. The tension in the text is screaming at this point, why aren't we destroyed?
We aren't destroyed because of who is holding the scalpel, and this profound realization bridges us to the climax of this entire section of Hebrews. The author pivots beautifully in verse 14. Having then a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let's hold tightly to our confession.
To truly feel the impact of that statement, we have to go back to the sensory world of the first century Jewish audience. We have to talk about the high priest and the Day of Atonement.
Yom Kippur. It was the most sacred, solemn, and terrifying day of the Jewish calendar. Once a year, the high priest, one single human being, was permitted to take the blood of a sacrificial animal and pass through the massive, heavy veil that separated the main temple from the Holy of Holies.
That inner sanctum.
Yes, this inner sanctum was where the immediate localized presence of the divine dwelled. He did this to make atonement, to cover the sins of the entire nation for the past year.
The historical details surrounding this are wild. It was an atmosphere of absolute dread. The tradition tells us that bells were woven into the hem of the high priest's garments and a rope was tied around his ankle.
Right, just in case.
If he entered that holy space, harboring hidden sin, the sheer purity of the divine presence would strike him dead. The people outside would listen for the bells. If the bells stopped ringing, they would use the rope to drag his body out because no one else dared to go in after him. That is the level of fear associated with approaching the divine.
That is the exact cultural backdrop the author is invoking. But he declares that Jesus is the great high priest. He didn't just pass through a woven curtain in a stone temple in Jerusalem. He passed through the very fabric of the heavens into the direct, unmediated presence of the Father.
And he performs this intercession not once a year with the blood of an animal, but eternally.
However, the author introduces a revolutionary, paradigm-shifting twist. This cosmic heavenly high priest is not a cold, distant, insulated executive.
The text in verse 15 says, "For we don't have a high priest who can't be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but one who has been in all points tempted like we are, yet without sin."
Touched with the feeling of our infirmities. The Greek language here implies a deep, visceral, co-suffering empathy. He isn't observing human history from a sterile boardroom in the sky, reviewing our rap sheets with clinical detachment.
He became human.
He is intimately acquainted with the dirt, the sweat, the tears, the betrayals, the physical pain, and the agonizing weakness of the human condition.
I have to pause and push back hard on this concept because it raises one of the most common and difficult skeptical objections to this text. It's an objection I've wrestled with myself. The text says he was tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin. If Jesus never actually sinned, if he never actually failed, how can he truly empathize with us?
That's a big question.
If someone has never given in to an addiction, do they really know how powerful it is? If he never experienced the shame of moral failure or the crushing weight of having ruined his own life through bad choices, doesn't his perfection actually distance him from our reality?
That is a brilliant, deeply intuitive question, and it requires us to fundamentally rethink how the mechanics of temptation and suffering actually operate. We tend to assume that yielding to a temptation gives us experiential knowledge of its power. We think failure equals understanding.
Right.
But let's look at the physics of resistance. Imagine you are standing in an open field trying to walk forward against a hurricane-force wind.
Okay, I'm bracing against the wind.
If the wind hits you, and after 5 seconds you completely collapse and let the wind blow you over, rolling you across the ground, how much of the wind's maximum force did you actually feel?
I only felt the initial gust.
Yeah.
Once I collapsed and went with the flow of the wind, the resistance stopped. I'm just tumbling.
Precisely. But if you stand your ground, if you dig your heels in, brace your body, and refuse to yield no matter how hard the wind howls, you feel the absolute maximum tearing force of that hurricane. You feel the strain in every muscle. You feel the sheer violence of the pressure. A person who gives in to a temptation early never feels its maximum pull. They surrender before the psychological or spiritual pressure reaches its peak.
That completely flips the script.
It does. Because Jesus never yielded to sin, he is the only human being who has ever felt the absolute maximum gravitational pull of human temptation and suffering. He bore the entire concentrated weight of the darkness without ever breaking. He didn't take the easy way out by surrendering.
So his perfection doesn't isolate him.
No, therefore, his perfection doesn't isolate him from our experience. It means he experienced the pressure of our reality to a degree we cannot even fathom. His empathy isn't shallower than ours, it is infinitely deeper. He knows exactly how brutal it is to be human.
He felt the hurricane at Category 5, while most of us collapse at a Category 2. That profoundly changes how I view his compassion. It means when the scalpel is exposing my deepest flaws, the person holding it isn't disgusted by me. He knows exactly how hard the wind was blowing when I fell.
And because of that unparalleled empathy, Matthew Henry points out a beautiful, staggering contrast in how we are invited to respond. Henry notes that given the absolute purity of God and the depth of our own self-deceit, God had every right to set up what he calls a tribunal of inexorable justice.
A cosmic courtroom where the only currency is strict, unyielding law.
And the penalty for failure is immediate, catastrophic execution.
But instead, because of the empathy of the great high priest, the author of Hebrews tells us God established something entirely different. Hebrews 4:16 says, "Let us therefore draw near with boldness to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and may find grace for help in time of need."
Draw near with boldness. The Greek word used here is parrhesia. It is a rich, politically charged term. In the ancient world, it referred to the freedom of speech granted to fully enfranchised citizens in a free city. It meant you had the right to speak your mind to the authorities without fear of reprisal or punishment.
You don't have to cower. You don't have to tie a rope around your ankle and hope you don't get struck by lightning. You don't have to clean yourself up, put on your psychological armor, or use fancy religious jargon. You have parrhesia. You have the absolute freedom to speak your broken, unfiltered truth directly before the creator of the cosmos.
And look carefully at what you are promised when you go to that throne. You don't go there to get what you deserve. The text promises two highly specific things: mercy and grace.
They're not synonyms.
They address two different aspects of our brokenness. Mercy is the pardon for the mess you have already made. It is the compassionate withholding of the punishment you earned. It covers your past unbelief, your past wanderings in the wilderness, your past failures to trust.
Mercy handles the past. So what is grace?
Grace is the dynamic, empowering help for the present moment. It is the divine strength, the specific provision you need for the challenge you are facing right now. In this exact time of need, you receive mercy for the timeline behind you and grace for the timeline in front of you.
It's the ultimate antidote to the wilderness of the mind. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you, our listener, with the final thought to mull over. We've covered massive territory today. We've talked about trusting the architect instead of the bricks. We've explored the devastating psychology of unbelief and cynicism. We've wrestled with the agony of dropping our self-justification to enter the sabbatismos rest. We've faced the terror of the divine scalpel.
It's a lot to process.
It is. Think about the concept of today that the author kept urging with such desperation. If you truly believed, not just intellectually, but in the marrow of your bones, that you had unrestricted, bold access to this throne of grace, if you believe that the one holding the scalpel knew the exact pressure of the hurricane you are facing, and that true soul-deep rest was available to you right now, without you having to earn it, how would it change your very next waking moment?
It's an open invitation. It is a call to stop running, to drop the exhausting resume, to stop hiding behind your armor, and simply approach the one who already knows you completely and loves you flawlessly.
What if today is the only real currency you have to change the trajectory of your life?
It's a powerful thought to end on.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.